Hello everybody, and welcome to episode 56 of the Wildlife Photography Q&A. Now, as always, I'll be answering some of the questions that you sent through for the week. Some of it, anything goes. It goes from wildlife to travel to photography. And even if you want to go the personal route like we did last week, then you're more than welcome to do so. So I've got quite a few questions that you guys have sent through, so thank you so much. A lot of it is very kind of repetitive, so I'll be sort of doing a general answer on all of those. But also some interesting ones from a photographic and from a travel point of view. So without wasting too much time, let's get straight into it. Question 1 coming up.
To photograph something that is fast, what is the best ISO, shutter speed and aperture to use?
Tammy, thank you so much for your question. I think it's something, we discussed this last week as well. It's very difficult to give a general answer for something like that. I think people often look for the shortcuts and things, and there is no shortcut way of photography in general. So the biggest thing you want to try and do when you're photographing an action scene is to have your shutter speed fast enough. Now let's take this in a scenario where you're photographing big cats, which they're generally active sort of late afternoon or early in the mornings, right? So when it's very low light. So in order for you to get a fast enough shutter speed, you need to have your other components play with that as well, which is your aperture and your ISO. Now, let's see, for example, when I say a fast shutter speed, it's anything from about 1,000th of a second upwards. Now, you have to get that balancing act together, right? And the important thing to understand, I'm going to try and explain it to you guys in as much detail as I can. The important thing to understand is, if your shutter speed is not fast enough to capture this action scene, you're going to end up with an image that's blurred, right? So then there's no use in that unless you go the panning route, which we're going to chat about a little bit later. But you want to have your shutter speed fast enough. So like I said, anything from a 1,600th of a second upwards, that should freeze the moment. Now, if you're in low light conditions, let's put it this way, if the light is good, you want to include as much depth of field as you possibly can. So maybe like f7.1, f8. But the more depth of field that you include, the slower your shutter speed will become, right? Now, in low light conditions, as much as you want to photograph at 7.1, because of the lack of light that's available to you, you won't be able to do that. So you have to sacrifice a bit of your depth of field, your aperture, to be able to get a fast enough shutter speed, yeah? The shallower the depth of field you choose, the faster your shutter speed will become as well. And then you've got your ISO, which is your camera's, your sensor's sensitivity to light, which there's no right ISO. ISO just has to fit in to whatever settings you want to include. I hope I'm making sense here, but that's why it's so important to understand shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. So let's say, for example, you shoot an aperture priority, low light, you've got the scene in front of you, a hunt is about to take place. You look through your camera, your shutter speed is maybe 600th of a second. That's not going to be fast enough to freeze the moment for you. So you're going to have to get a faster shutter speed. If you've taken your aperture right down, say for example you're shooting with a 2.8 or an f4 lens, if you've done it f4 and your shutter speed is still maybe only 800th of a second, the only thing you can then do is increase your ISO. Now, increase your ISO to what number? Whatever number it takes to get your shutter speed faster. Okay, so say for example you're on 1,000 ISO and your shutter speed is 800th of a second, put your ISO up to 3,200th of a second. You have a look through your camera again, your shutter speed is now 1,600th of a second. That's fine, you can fire away. If your shutter speed is still not fast enough, increase your ISO even more. Now I know a lot of you guys would say, oh, I don't shoot high ISOs and I only shoot up to ISO 2000. Then a lot of the time in wildlife photography, you're going to miss those shots, right? So it's a case of dealing with that ISO later on. But because you're going to get a bit of noise, right? So those little pixels, if your ISO is a little bit higher. But it's either it's either that or not having a shot at all. So I would personally shoot at whatever ISO, whatever it takes, even if it's 6,400 or 8,000 ISO, to be able to get that shutter speed fast enough to be able to freeze that moment. Guys, I hope that makes sense. There's a lot of questions that where people ask on settings for a specific moment. You can't. It all depends on the light that's available to you. If you guys struggle with understanding the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, get in touch with me. Send me an email, send me a DM, and I'm happy to even do a personalized video for you, which I'll send to you to help you understand a little bit better. Once you understand that triangle of light, how it all fits together, you'll be able to create anything from a photography point of view.
How to start wildlife photography means from where?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. And I think it's another one that we get quite a lot is, how do you start with photography? And you start. Have you got a camera? If not, you're not going to be able to do wildlife photography if you don't have a camera yet. I hope I'm making sense here. And it's, I think a lot of the times people are intimidated by it, but if you don't go get a camera and don't go out in the field and do it, you're never going to become a wildlife photographer. Or that's also, even the wildlife photographer term by itself is something that's quite debatable. But I think it's important that you go through the different requirements. Get a camera, right? Go to the field, start photographing, and go from there. And it's, look, nothing that you do you're going to be good at from the beginning. Whether you're taking up golf or driving lessons, or we did acrobatics yesterday, which was a whole nother story altogether. But nothing that you do from the beginning you're going to be good at, right? So invest your time in there. Do your research. I mean, there's more than enough online now from a photography point of view for you to be able to start and get to know your camera. Get a camera, get into the field, start photographing. If you enjoy it, your passion will grow. You'll get more serious about it, and the better you will get. But just go out there and start photographing. Get out of your office, stop wondering about it, and just go out there and do it.
Should we worry about speed when camera on tripod but trying to capture action scene?
Okay, the short answer of that is yes. If you're photographing an action scene, like I mentioned before, you have to have a fast shutter speed, even if you're on a tripod, because if you don't have a tripod, all it's doing is it's eliminating your sort of handshake, or camera shake as we call it. As much as we'd like to think we don't shake, we do. So that rule of your shutter speed should be 1 over focal length. So if I'm using a 400mm lens, a 400 sort of shutter speed, 400th of a second, that will eliminate some of the camera shake that I have. But if you're photographing a cheetah hunting on the plains, 400th of a second is not going to freeze that moment. So even if your camera is on a tripod, you need to have a fast shutter speed to be able to freeze that moment. Hope it makes sense. Once again, if I can help you understand the triangle of light, get in touch, let me know, and I'm happily, I'll do a video for you or answer any of the questions that you might have. Right, next question.
What kind of camera type and lenses would you recommend a beginner in wildlife photography?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. And again, it's one that we get a lot. It's so I'm going to ask you a question. What car should I buy? It depends what you want to do. It's the same thing with photography. What are you wanting to photograph? Are you photographing landscapes? Are you photographing weddings? Are you photographing portraits? Are you photographing wildlife? And what is your budget? Okay, so if you go to a camera shop, people might want to sell you the latest and greatest equipment that's out there, and 2 weeks later you might find out that this whole photography thing is not for you. So I'm a firm believer. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It depends what you want to photograph, what you want to do, how far you want to go with your photography. I would say get in entry level. Start off entry level. It's not going to break the budget. It will give you the opportunity to play with your camera and to understand it a bit better. And then from there you can see what sort of niche that you want to get into. For me, from a wildlife point of view, like now, if I had to buy a camera, I would look for things that suit my needs. So I love photographing late afternoons, early evenings, sort of that low light. So from a camera point of view, I want something that's got quite a fast frame rate, and the megapixels should be quite high as well, especially if I want to print something a bit bigger. And then the lens that I would look for will be something that, from a focal length point of view, if you're dealing with wildlife, a lot of the time you're playing around that sort of between 300 and 600 mil range, more often than not. And then something that can deal with low light. So ideally like a 2.8 or f4 lens. That'll be something that I would look for from a wildlife photography point of view. So a camera that can deal with high ISOs, a decent frame rate, and a lens that can deal with low light. If you're photographing landscapes, then those things won't be as important. You're probably looking for something with maybe a bit more megapixels. But yeah, look at what you want to photograph and then go from there. That'll be my answer.
How do you cope with practicing when you're not on safari or in the field?
Okay, that's a great one. I'm really enjoying that one, and it's something that we discuss quite a bit in the office. Personally, I picked the camera up for the first time in I think about 5 months, a few weeks ago. And for me personally, I must say I've really enjoyed sort of putting a camera down and not having to pick it up. I think, when you're photographing a lot and you're doing it time and time again, you do naturally go through a phase where you get kind of bored, like creatively. I think that's what where it was for me. So I really enjoyed putting the camera down and not having to worry about taking images at all. What I am enjoying at the moment though is a lot more the video side of it. So we're doing a lot of content around Johannesburg, which we'll be sharing with you guys in the coming weeks. But that's what I'm really enjoying now, is the video skills, and it's great with having us guys all together that we can sort of jump or feed ideas off each other, which we don't often get to do out in the field. We're focusing on our clients and you're helping them with their photography. I would say, if you going on safari maybe like once a year or once every 2 years, practice out in the garden, and especially with the creative stuff, the slow shutter stuff, you can practice perfectly with your dogs or your cats, or even if you have kids, go and practice that way and really get creative with your images, because once you do it, then the wildlife side of things will also just become so much easier. And the great thing with kids and dogs is you can probably have them practice and go back and do it time and time again. So that'll be my advice, is practice with what you have in your garden. It doesn't always have to be wildlife, it could be kids or people as well. Go from there.
How to do a panning shot.
Right, Jordan, thank you so much for your question. Panning is something that I love to do, and I think creatively it really speaks to me from a wildlife photography point of view. For those of you that don't know what the panning shot is, it's those images where you get ideally your subject sort of semi-stationary, but you've got the movement behind them. So you often see it with fast-moving subjects, guys that photograph Formula One. You get those lines in the background. And this is achieved by photographing with a very slow shutter speed. Again, the shutter speed is going to depend on how fast your subject is moving. And then ideally you want to have your camera as steady as possible, so resting it on a beanbag or a tripod, so you just get the vertical lines, you don't get the horizontal lines. And then you're moving at the same speed as the subject while keeping your finger on the shutter. So again, it's very difficult to give an exact shutter speed. I found that with something moving quite slow, like a lion or a leopard walking, around about a sixth or an eighth of a second works quite well. And the cool thing with this is the slower you go, the more chances of your whole image being blurred. But when you get it right, the reward is also so much higher. So let's take a lion or a leopard walking. Again, like I said, your camera as steady as possible, and you photographing as the lion walks past. You're moving the same speed as the subject while keeping your finger on the shutter. Something that runs like a zebra running, or a herd of wildebeest, then you have to go a little bit faster, maybe like a 30th of a second 15th to a 30th of a second, well then you'll get that sort of that panning motion. I would always encourage people, if you've photographed a particular scene, whether it be elephants or whatever you have in the field, work on that, what we call the 20-60-20 approach. So your first 20% of your scene, you're banking the shots. You're getting proof shots. The second 60%, you're trying to tell a story with your images. And then the last 20%, you're really just messing around. Get creative. Go those slow shutter speed routes. You can do radial blur. There's motion blur, intentional camera movement. There's a million and one things that you can use. But that would really sort of push you from a creativity point of view, and it will also give you a little bit more sort of diverse portfolio, if that makes sense. I hope that helps. If you have any questions with that in particular, or if you want to see some more examples, give me a shout. Very happy to assist. I think it's a great way to take your photography to the next level.
What's more important, a good lens or a good camera body?
Daniel, thank you for your question. I think, once again, it depends what you're doing. For me personally, I would choose the glass, the lens over the camera. But having said that, the cameras these days also play a massive part in your images. You've got frame rate, which becomes quite important in some cases from a wildlife point of view. So that's how many photos your camera actually takes per second, which it's not sort of going with a spray and pray approach, but if you've got an action scene in front of you, it does help to have a camera that's got a little bit faster burst rate, where if you're photographing landscapes, you don't need that all that much. So I would I would still go the glass route, choose the lens first before the camera. But having said that, your camera also does play a big part. Again, if you're starting off your wildlife photography, go entry level, guys. You don't have to get the latest and greatest camera. Your better camera is not necessarily going to mean better images, right? If I go buy a different set of golf clubs, it won't mean that I'm going to play a better round of golf. If that makes sense. All right, thanks for your question. Great one. Guys, thank you so much. So that's all the questions for this week. Like I said, there's quite a few repetitive ones that we're kind of receiving week after week. How you get into the industry and what camera you get. And these are going to start sort of passing over the next coming weeks, because I think we've answered it in every possible way that we can. Get out in the field, photograph. You don't need to get the latest and greatest cameras. Understand your camera gear that you have first, and then if you have any specific questions regarding your camera and how to improve on certain levels, then we can have a discussion. But to the broader images of what camera I must get and how to get into the industry, I think we've answered that in the last few episodes. So yeah, hope that makes sense. But that's it from my side. Thank you so much for sending those questions through. Again, like always, you're welcome to send your questions through to Gerry or myself. Our emails are down at the bottom. We look forward to answering some of those in the coming weeks. We'll do this again next week, same time, same place. And we want to maybe have a look at deconstructing one of the videos on YouTube and just sort of answering some of the comments that we've received from there. But we'll update you guys and see how we go. It all just depends how many questions we get through next week. But yeah, once again, thank you for watching. Thank you for your time. And we'll catch up with you guys again next week. My name is Johan. Until next time, cheers.